I'm Doy Santos, and you're on the cusp. Today on the cusp, I'll be going over some of my observations of the government's comprehensive tax reform package, the Tax Reform for Acceleration and Inclusiveness, or TRAIN. Now, this tax reform package is the cornerstone of Dutertenomics, President Duterte's economic strategy for the Philippines. And without it, he's not going to be able to achieve all of the things that he wants to under his Build program. A program that is designed to spread the benefits of growth outside of Metro Manila through a very robust infrastructure and capital outlay spending program. So the first installment of this package was actually passed in the lower house not too long ago, and it now sits with the Senate, which has to decide whether to pass the measure as well. President Duterte, of course, has given this bill his seal of approval and has signified to Congress that it is one of his urgent bills that needs immediate attention, because the goal is to have the new tax measures in place by January next year. So if Congress is not able to pass this package by the end of the year, then many of the projects and programs that it intends to fund are not going to proceed, and will in fact be stalled for the foreseeable future. And that will be a very big setback for his administration, which seeks in the medium term to lift the growth of the Philippines from its current 6 to 7% per annum trajectory to a 7 to 8% rate of growth per year, a much higher growth trajectory. Now, Dutertenomics breaks with the Aquino administration's previous orthodoxy of using PPPs, or public-private partnerships, in order to fund public infrastructure. That previous philosophy of the Aquino administration was based on the user pays principle, which basically means that, as it is called, the user pays. Basically, if you want highway that goes from here to the next city, then the users are going to have to fork out money each time they travel on that road. The Duterte administration has broken with that tradition, and is veering more towards a more conventional approach of government pays, or the taxpayer funding public projects. And they've said as well that they're not really opposed to the notion or the concept of PPPs. In fact, the government wants to adopt a hybrid model whereby the government builds the infrastructure and then hands it over, or auctions it over to a private contractor who then takes charge of its maintenance and operations. Now, the budget papers of the first budget for this fiscal year suggests that President Duterte wants public expenditures on infrastructure to nearly double, from about 650 billion pesos which is where it stood in 2016, to 1.2 trillion by 2019. That would take capital outlay from 4.5% of GDP in 2016 to about 6.3% of GDP by 2019. And the goal is actually for it to reach 7% of GDP by the year 2022, when President Duterte's term in office ends. This means that government disbursements will have to necessarily rise as a share of GDP from 18.2% in 2016 to about 20.2% of GDP. And what that means is that when your disbursements are rising at that rate, government revenues have to keep up in order to prevent government from overborrowing, which is the case if there are only two ways to pay for expenses. You either increase your revenue or you borrow, right? So historically, governments have, over the past 6 years, has been incurring a deficit of somewhere between 1 and 2.5%. But the Duterte administration believes that up to 3% of GDP per annum is still sustainable, given the growth rate that the economy is expected to follow over the next few years. The Philippines, after all, is slated to remain one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing economy in the region. So for the tax measures to not be in place would mean that government would not be able to fund its capital outlay program, would mean that government would not be able to fulfill its promise of allowing or facilitating the benefits of growth to be spread across the nation. So that would be a major stumbling block in achieving the change that President Duterte has promised to the Filipino nation. So how will he achieve that? How is President Duterte going to be able to fund this significant ramp up in capital outlay? The train basically raises about 300 billion pesos worth of revenue in its first year, and this is going to be achieved through a combination of increased excise taxation on automobiles and fuel, as well as imposing a new tax on sugary drinks, the so-called sugar tax, and also through the removal of exemptions on the value-added tax. And I'll be going into that shortly. And aside from that, lastly, it's also going to be raising revenue through some tax administrative measures, the most significant of which is the fuel marking proposal, which would prevent the smuggling of fuel into the country, which it is estimated to be registering a loss for the government from between 20 to 40 billion pesos a year. So all of these measures combined are expected to generate somewhere in the region of 300 billion pesos per annum. Now, this tax reform package, there are two parts to it. The first part is basically what I've just mentioned, increasing, doubling the excise tax rate on fuel and increasing it for vehicles, automotive vehicles, and removing the exemptions on VAT. But the other side of it as well is giving tax breaks to individuals and companies, right, by lowering the marginal income tax rate on individuals and the corporate tax rate to bring it more in line with the rest of our neighboring countries in ASEAN. And so the net result of this is that of the 300 billion pesos that the government aims to raise through the measures that I've just mentioned, it's actually going to hand back, right, about 140 billion pesos to individuals and companies. Now, the government obviously is doing this for two reasons. One of which is to help, help people swallow the bitter pill of the increased consumption taxes, right, by lowering income taxes. But on the other hand, it's also an economic efficiency measure, in the sense that lowering taxes on individuals and companies is going to encourage investment, foreign investment, domestic investment, right? And encourage companies to hire more people, hire more staff. And so this is going to generate sort of a faster pace of growth, not only the spending of government, but the tax concessions that government's going to be providing. So of the 300 billion, about 47% is going to be handed back in the form of tax breaks. The remaining 53%, or 160 billion, is going to be reserved for its social and economic programs, right? Social and economic programs, which form part of the Build program, where they'll be constructing hospitals and schools, hiring teachers and health workers, and also, constructing new airports and building trains and subways, and there's a whole sort of lineup of these major projects that are in the works. And the idea is that the government doesn't have to wait for complex deal making to happen under the PPPs. It can forge ahead, it can go ahead with the additional revenues. It doesn't even need to wait for creditors to lend it money. It's going to be able to fund additional spending in capital, in physical infrastructure this way. Now, some of the revenue measures that it was expecting were lost in Congress when Congress decided not to follow the script in totality. Some of the proposed removal of exemptions on people with disabilities, the elderly, as well as cooperatives, were turned down by Congress. So they maintained the existing exemptions on those groups. So this caused some erosion on the revenue side, but the government just basically turned around and said, okay, if you're going to sort of lessen the amount that we can raise, then we're just going to lower the amount of spending that we're going to engage in. So they've lowered it on a pro rata basis. So perhaps rather than it being like a 47-53 split, it's probably closer to 1:1. So for every peso that the government raises through, if it passes now, if the House version is similarly adopted in the Senate, then that means that roughly about for every peso that the government raises in revenue, about 50 cents is going to be given back to taxpayers, and then the remaining 50% is going to be used for infrastructure spending, both economic and social infrastructure, that is. So you probably think that overall the government strategy was quite sound. It's like we're raising revenue on the one hand, but we're also creating fiscal stimulus with the other. But at the forum, I decided to test the fairness of some of these measures by asking whether or not it was fair to lower the tax on high net worth individuals while applying the VAT to some sectors of the society, our society, that sort of like provide some kind of social benefit. So here's the response I got. Please watch this short clip. You couch this as one with the 99, and I think it's commendable in terms of the aim to make tax reform progressive, to fund projects for the 99. However, I wonder whether within that sort of framing, whether we might have gotten something a bit off in some parts. For example, I was at the office of Senator Sandy for 2 hours yesterday, and he told me while I was there that the Girl Scouts were going to meet with him because they were concerned that these reforms were going to hit them. And then on the other side of the scale, you're cutting taxes on people earning $250,000. So I was just wondering whether it's one with a 99 or should it be one with a 90, for example. How can we justify taxing the Girl Scouts and giving tax cuts to people earning $250,000 above? But even equity issues aside, maybe from the tax administration point of view, it might be easier to tax the people earning $250,000 because you just withdraw that from their salaries, right? Whereas the Girl Scouts, you have to, I don't know, go through the procedure. It's a bit harder to implement that. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that issue. Perhaps Undersecretary.
Sir, just to clarify, that Girl Scouts, if ever there's an income tax exemption for the Girl Scouts, it's been retained. What's being taxed is what's being removed is an exemption on VAT for the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. What does that mean? So supposedly if the Girl Scouts sell cookies, for example, which is a business activity, and it reaches the VAT threshold, they need to pay VAT. Just like any other business establishment. At least to me, that's fair. That's not an issue of, to me, that's not an issue of enforceability, or that's not an issue of administration. It's an issue of basic fairness. Girl Scouts selling cookies is no different from any other business selling any other good or service.
So as you can see from that short clip, the finance officials were quite adamant in saying that the meaning of fairness was such that an organization like the Girl Scouts of the Philippines, which is basically a voluntary organization, right, needed to be treated just like any other business in the country. So, you might say this is quite puzzling because, after all, they're not exactly what you might call a business. They provide, a kind of social benefit in terms of training people to have sort of like a sense of civic duty, and they fund their operations through fundraising, like selling cookies from door to door. I found this quite puzzling in the sense that from a tax administration point of view, I couldn't understand why one of the finance officials said that it wasn't an issue. But obviously, like if you're an organization that's run by volunteers and you go knocking on doors to sell cookies, you're not in the habit of like issuing receipts. Now, another thing I also worried about was whether it was wise for government to embark on an expansion of income transfers to ward off the temporary inflationary effects of this tax measure. Here is Budget Secretary Ben Diokno explaining what these income transfers and inflationary mitigation efforts will be once TRAIN has been adopted. Have a look.
So granted, the tax reform will have some short-term impact on prices, we have put in place mitigating measures to temper these effects. So, for example, 40% of the incremental revenues from oil excise will be used to fund 5 social mitigating measures. The targeted cash transfer program, Pantawid Pasada, Pantawid Kuryente, the PUV modernization program, and the social welfare card system. First, on the targeted cash transfer program. This would benefit the poorest 10 million households. That's the bottom half. There would be an unconditional cash transfer of 200 pesos per month or 2,400 per year. And this will be implemented by the DSWD under the management of NEDA. This program seeks to extend financial assistance to our poorest countrymen to ease their burden in making their ends meet. And this is in line with the administration's commitment to change, ensuring a better life for all sectors, especially the poor.
So from Secretary Bendiocna's explanation, we can see that the government intends to give 300 pesos a month as an unconditional income transfer to about 10 million Filipino households, or the bottom half of society, in the first year when the new taxes hit, because finance has modeled that about that there's going to be an inflationary effect of all of these increased taxes of about 0.9%. So if the inflation rate were, let's say, 1.5%, then that means overall inflation for that year would rise up to about 2.4 when you add the 0.9 percentage point to it. So obviously there's going to be a hit. There's going to be hit felt. So this is going to raise prices, and they're quite frank and open about that, which is good, which is a good thing. They're not in denial. So in order to mitigate, and cushion the impact on the most vulnerable, this is what the government plans to do, along with some other measures aimed at, softening the blow, as it were. Now, all I can say about that is that I hope that government does a better job than they did with the 4Ps, or the Pantawid Pamilya program. Studies have found that up to 30% of the recipients of this program were not the intended beneficiaries, meaning to say they weren't the poorest of the poor, all right? They were perhaps near poor, but they weren't really the most, the worst off in our society. Because I say that since if you are earning about less than 250,000 pesos a year, which is about 20,000 pesos a month. So if you're earning that amount or less, right, as poor Filipinos would be, then you don't actually get an income tax benefit because you're already exempt from paying income taxes at the moment. So there's no marginal benefit for you under this program. But what there will be is a marginal cost of about 0.9 percentage point increase in the prices of goods as a result of all of the excise tax increase, perhaps on fuel and vehicles, right? So that means the poor are going to take a hit, and the government recognizes that and says that, okay, we're going to be from the money that we raise, we're going to transfer some of that to the poor, so that they can cope with the bad effects of this tax. And by that way, we the progressive nature of this tax is going to be maintained, right? Now, the question is whether they will in fact get the compensation. Secretary Jokno believes that they've got it covered. There's going to be a universal ID card that will be handed to them, which they will use. There's going to be a well-targeted system. It's just such a pity that the Secretary for Social Welfare wasn't there to answer these concerns, right? it's quite puzzling on my part, because this basically the fairness test of this task is going to rise or fall depending on how well the government is able to execute the unconditional cash transfer scheme. And remember, the 4Ps, or Pantawid Pamilya, is currently benefiting about 4 million households. This is more than double that amount, right? So logistically, it's going to be more difficult and more challenging to administer this program, right? And to monitor it and to make sure it's being performed. Of course, it's only going to last for a year, but that year could really spell the difference in terms of the perception of the people, in terms of how this government performs, right? So I thought, that's the measure itself is quite rational, but I'm just not sure whether the government is up to the task of being able to deliver on that policy. Now, another observation I'd like to make was, after the forum, I actually got to speak to a representative of an organization representing the elderly and people with disabilities. So they seem to have a different take on what Congress did by maintaining the VAT exemption for this sector. Their position was that rather than giving them a benefit on the revenue side, what government should be doing is actually increasing spending on their sector. Meaning to say, all right, you give VAT exemptions to the elderly in our society, but they can only claim that, they can only get a benefit from that, derive a benefit from that, if they consume, if they spend money. And what they would prefer to see is more like a universal pension scheme that incorporates or includes the middle class in our society, because at the moment it only covers the poor. So rather than giving me a discount at the store, which I can only claim if I spend my money, how about just increasing my income? So then I can decide what to do with that, whether I invest it, spend it on things, or on a house, or whatever, or give it to my children, or whatnot. So from their perspective, they weren't really impressed by the concession that was given to them by Congress, which made me think that when it comes to policy, sometimes politicians think that they're actually doing a good job, by pandering to a certain sector, but the sector itself doesn't see it as such, because they think that the priorities are misplaced. They would much rather pay the VAT on goods that they consume if government sort of gave them or expanded the pension scheme to include, most of the elderly within the middle class, or people with disabilities, because that's much more important to them. So I thought that was an interesting comment on that package, on that part of the package. Now, so this brings me now to back to the question that I originally posed. So on the whole, is Duterte's train on the right track? All right, so let's weigh things up. I think I would have to say that on the whole, train for me is on the right track with some reservations. I have been blogging for quite some time now. I personally agree with the thesis that government spending on economic services has been lacking over the past 6 years. The execution of the PPPs was too slow. So the delivery of government infrastructure just did not keep pace with the rest of the economy. In fact, it was slowing down the economy. The PPP is a policy tool that you only apply to certain types of infrastructure projects, but not to all of them by and large. And the Aquino administration was trying to shirk its responsibility for certain things by shifting it to the private sector, when it should have been, you know, on the front foot. You know, and they tried to correct that with the disbursement acceleration program, which to me was the same as, you know, government spending. So why didn't they just do that themselves? You know, why did they have to, you know, they were so strict with the way they were monitoring public works programs, but when it came to the congressmen, they just sort of gave them a free rein, so to speak, you know. So from that angle, I believe that government has a role to play in a developing, emerging context. When you know, obviously interest rates are at an all-time low, as Ben Jokno used to say during those years. It was almost criminal. It was almost criminal not to engage, not to invest during that period of time. And this period of time, the window that of low interest rates is slowly going to close now. It's slowly coming to an end as the U.S. Federal Reserve starts to unwind, you know, the monetary stimulus that had put in place in response to the global financial crisis, right? So, you know, we probably only have a few years left before interest rates start ticking back up. So during this time, you know, it makes sense for government to take advantage of cheaper money when it can. And for me, without this kind of spending, the growth of our economy is going to be constrained, right? We're going to be hitting capacity constraints. We're already feeling it now, you know, whereby, you know, an economy growing at 6 to 7% every year is going to need infrastructure to keep up with that pace of growth. You can't grow. Your population's growing, your economy is growing. So obviously there's going to be a demand for government services, right? So if you're not able to keep up with that demand, then obviously your economy is going to overheat. So when the economy overheats, then that means that all that growth is just going to result in inflation. You know, people are just going to raise the prices because they don't have the capacity to meet the demand that's put upon them. So in order to reduce that demand, they just raise their prices. That's basic economics 101. And finally, you know, taxes and spending really of government has to really grow as a proportion of the economy. They are really, they've been at a very low ebb at this point. I mean, we haven't even returned to the pre-Asian financial crisis levels of spending as a percentage of GDP. So we have to sort of like get back on track with that. And this is the, you know, the best possible way to do that, and to do it whilst reducing income taxes and corporate taxes to make us competitive with the rest of our ASEAN neighbors. However, I still feel there could be further room for refinement when the measure is tackled at the Senate. So I hope our senators examine closely whether our government will have the capacity, for instance, to administer the unconditional cash transfer program well, and at that massive scale, and in such a short period of time. By January next year, that system has to be in place. Do we have the capacity, and do we have, you know, the systems in place so that we can sort of launch into that from day one? I also think that there are some equity and administrative features that could be tweaked at the margins. But of course, this is almost sort of nitpicking on my part, you know. On the broad outlines, it's sound, I think. But on the margin, I think there's still some things that the Senate can improve upon, you know, to make this a more a more humane, a more progressive type of tax reform package. But overall, I believe that the public ought to support these measures and hop on to Duterte's train. If we don't support these measures at this crucial time, then we shouldn't really be complaining about the daily traffic, the daily mess, the parlous state of our trains, our airports, our hospitals, and schools that are crumbling and suffering from neglect. In the end, if we want better governance, we will need to spend for it. If we refuse to spend for it, then we actually deserve what we get. You get what you pay for, basically. So in the end, that's really the crux of it. If we wanna grow and reach a higher plane of growth, if we want growth to filter down outside of Metro Manila, if we want to become more competitive with our tax rates, we need to bite the bullet. We need to focus on ways by which government can pay for all of the services, while at the same time, not putting a disincentive for investors, disincentive for work. So at the end of the day, people are just going to have to realize that government, services don't fall out from the sky. That somebody eventually has to pay for it. As long as the investment is on things that will increase the productive capacity of our country, then it's a good thing. We need to get behind that, because every time we travel or go to work or go abroad, we see the capacity constraints are there. We love to complain about it, but when it comes time to actually doing something about it, when the government says, all right, it's time to pay your fair share, we're a consumptions oriented society, so part of that consumption basically has to be tempered in order to make way for the infrastructure that allows us to enjoy those things. So in the end, it's a good measure overall, Duterte's train, and it's a crucial point in the cycle. And our citizens need to let their legislators know that it's okay. There's a constituency for this kind of reform in our society, because otherwise, legislators they want to reflect the will of the people, and if the will of the people says that, we're just not interested, in growing our economy or providing for the services, then there's really nothing they can do. It's a tough gig, actually, being a politician in such a situation. So if we want these benefits of growth and revenue to reach us, then we need to support them. We need to support them and give consent, express our support, and not stand in the way. Because I believe that in our society today, we can all agree that the Philippines can do much better than the daily grind that we're suffering today. And so if the measures are fair and reasonable and equitably shared, and the people that are going to be hit hard are compensated and supported, then we should give our consent. And later on, if the government is unable to execute some of its plan, then yes, by all means, let's criticize them, let's monitor them, let's perform oversight. But in the meantime, let's give the government the benefit of the doubt. Let's get behind them, because after all of this is designed to benefit us in the end. So this has been another edition of The Cusp. Visit us online on cusp-ph.blogspot.com or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you again for watching. Hope you subscribe to my channel on YouTube. This has been Doy Santos. Hope to see you again next time on another edition of The Cusp.